In Japanese mythology, there are several mentions of a dark netherworld, a gloomy, mystical realm known as Yomi no Kuni, or just Yomi for short. It's mainly associated with the Japanese nature religion Shintoism, which proposes that the world at large is made up of 3 primary layers, with Yomi existing at the bottom. While there's a variety of interpretations about its true nature, the general consensus about Yomi is that of a subterranean world drenched in perpetual shadow, a place where the spirits of the deceased travel to after passing. It goes by a variety of names and pseudonyms, some of which include Land of the Dead, World of Darkness, and Land of Gloom. In addition, there's a few locations which are speculated to be either closely connected to Yomi or one and the same, like Ne no Kuni, the Land of Roots, and Soko no Kuni, or Hollow Land. Because of its characterization as a place deep below the earth, some have drawn parallels between Yomi and the more widely known Hell or Hades. However, this is not really an accurate comparison to make. Yomi is not a place of fire and brimstone, torture and eternal damnation. There's no judgment, no reward or punishment, and thus it can be viewed as neither a paradise nor hell. It's just a place where spirits go and hang out, I guess. In that sense, it has more in common with the concept of limbo or purgatory than anything else. Unlike purgatory, however, which is often visualized as a sort of separate reality, a dimension between dimensions, Yomi is allegedly a real tangible place that shares a geographical continuation with the mortal world, i.e. it exists on the same plane as Earth itself. You can even visit the area in Japan where, according to legend, the entrance to Yomi is said to exist, though according to the stories it was sealed off by a massive boulder. As is to be expected, the Japanese underworld and various characters associated with it have been incorporated in several works of fiction, all of which take creative liberty and put their own spin on it. If you played Persona 4, for example, you're probably familiar with the names Izanagi and Izanami, which are 2 gods or kami who play a big role in the creation myth of Japan, and whose backstory is most closely tied to Yomi. To oversimplify, Izanami was the first kami to die and transition into the underworld. Meanwhile, Izanagi, in an attempt to reunite with her, traveled to Yomi, only to be chased out again by both Izanami herself and an ensemble of nightmare-inducing monstrosities, which ultimately led to Izanagi sealing the entrance to the underworld. Again, it's a gross simplification of the actual story, so if you ever want to read the full thing, I'll put a link to it in the description below. Just be advised that it gets pretty weird at times. Anyway, before we talk more about the Japanese underworld, let's first discuss its significance for today's topic, which, as you've probably guessed, is the influence it may have had on The Legend of Zelda, more specifically on the latest entry in the series. I suspect that Tears of the Kingdom's depths have been inspired by the concept of Yomi, as the two share quite a few similarities. From the dark and gloomy atmosphere, the presence of lingering spirits, to its vast subterranean landscape. Unlike the many exotic dimensions seen across the series like the Dark World, Twilight Realm and parallel dimensions like Termina, the depths are different in that they don't require some sort of magic portal to access. Instead, you just drop down into a crevice and transition into the world below Hyrule seamlessly. This implies that the depths are not in fact a separate dimension, but simply a massive hollow space that has existed deep below the kingdom for who knows how long, maybe since the world's creation. It's a common theme in Zelda where the deeper you go, the more you'll be confronted by all sorts of supernatural elements, from desolate crypts to nightmarish hellscapes, and the influences behind these locations can vary. For example, the basement level of Skyward Sword's ancient cistern is most likely based on the concept of Jigoku, the Buddhist equivalent of hell, which I'm not going to show too much of because I'd prefer if this video stays monetized. Like seriously, a lot of the artwork is pretty messed up. As opposed to Yomi, Jigoku is a place of torture and punishment, albeit not for eternity. And since the ancient cistern as a whole is themed after Buddhism, it's all but certain that Jigoku was the main inspiration for the bottom half of this dungeon. It even features a gameplay section based on a famous Buddhist legend, where a sinner tries to escape from hell by climbing up a spider's thread. However, that's not what we see in Tears of the Kingdom's underworld. The depths are mostly just dark and melancholic. It has its own ecosystem with all sorts of unique vegetation and fauna. There's remnants of mines, factories, and other activity from living people. If it wasn't for the supernatural elements, the depths could easily be mistaken for just an oversized cave system and nothing more. However, the fact that it does feature things like spirits, monsters, and demonic statues who are in the business of trading souls hints that the depths are definitely more than that, and has some sort of connection to the afterlife. The most compelling evidence for this by far are the bargainers. It seems the main purpose of these godlike entities trapped in stone is to serve as a sort of guide for the souls who find themselves trapped down here, to help them transition into the afterlife, and when they do so without passing judgment. In their own words, good and evil are futile concepts to them. To me, this is the most telling feature of the depths that ties it to the Shinto underworld as opposed to, say, the Christian or Buddhist hell, because it doesn't seem to matter who these spirits were or what they did in life. They're all treated equally. While doing research for this video, it became apparent that trying to paint an accurate picture of Yomi is surprisingly difficult, because despite its increased popularity as a topic or as a source of inspiration for things like horror stories, Yomi isn't actually all that prevalent in the Shinto religion, especially in the current day. Shintoism tends to focus more on life here and now as opposed to whatever comes after. So simple things like what the underworld looks like exactly, where it's located, or what ultimately happens to spirits once they enter it are left pretty vague. Hence why depictions of this elusive world can vary so greatly between media. It's all based on interpretations of ancient texts and folklore, few of which go into great detail about Yomi itself and instead focuses more on the characters and the events that take place there. The earliest mention of Yomi no Kuni in Japanese mythology is in the Kojiki, which is basically a collection of old myths and legends divided into 3 books or volumes. They are considered to be the oldest surviving writings from ancient Japan, and Yomi is only featured twice. Once in the aforementioned creation story involving Izanagi and Izanami, and again in a later story about the god of storms, Susanoo, who ends up getting banished to Yomi for reasons I won't get into here. Again, links to these stories will be in the description below. Prior to the Kojiki, the concept of Yomi was most likely derived from the Chinese underworld, called Huangchen, because not only do they share a lot of traits, but also the kanji are identical. In fact, while making the thumbnail for this video, my fiancé, who is from China, walked into my office and said, "You know, that's a very scary word for us." To which I said, "Deal with it." Actually, I didn't say that, but I did ask her for a definition, and according to her, it roughly translates to underground spring, underworld, or land of the dead, same as in Japanese. How 2 characters can translate to so many different things will forever be a mystery to me, but I mean, Asian languages are about as alien to me as Mark Zuckerberg is. So while it's not easy to pinpoint the exact nature of Yomi and its inner workings, we can at least go over some of the alleged features which I think are somewhat proportional to Tears of the Kingdom's underworld. The most common characteristics that are repeated throughout multiple sources are dark, shadowy, gloomy, foggy, and cold. I also found a couple of sources that claim that some parts of Yomi can mirror locations from the world above. It can look similar, yet different. This is a common theme in the depths as well. The entire map is essentially an inverse of Hyrule's landscape. Mountains above are valleys below and vice versa. Most landmarks have an accompanying structure below it, and the names of the light routes are the names of the shrines in reverse. Furthermore, according to a Shinto scholar and theologist, Yomi is not just a dark and barren wasteland. Quote, "It should not mistakenly be imagined that this realm is devoid of light. It has food, clothing, and houses of various kinds, similar to those of the visible world. Proof of this may be found in accounts in which a person has occasionally returned to tell of the realm of the dead." End quote. That last sentence indicates that Yomi is not exclusive to dead people alone, and has in fact been visited by the living as well, some of which return to tell the tale. I do have to clarify that just because Yomi is neither hell nor paradise, it's definitely not without danger. Those who decide to venture here for one reason or another do run a considerable risk of getting trapped here forever, joining the dead. And the same applies to the depths as well. Whoever sets foot down here can easily fall victim to the many dangers lurking in the dark, and become the next soul to be added to the collection. There's even an account from the Yiga that says that some of the clansmen had their souls taken from them when they tried to approach the bargainer statues. As for the spirits who reside in Yomi, their experience is described as a gloomy and shadowy existence, and that the only suffering they endure, if any at all, is their separation from their living loved ones. The last thing to highlight is that, aside from spirits and the occasional living visitor, Yomi is also home to an ensemble of kami, like the aforementioned ruler of the underworld Izanami, the god of storms Susanoo, and others like the thunder god Daijin, who was born in the underworld. With all that said, I think it's time we leave the mythology portion behind for the most part and focus on some of the in-universe aspects of Tears of the Kingdom's netherworld, and theorize about some of the stuff going on down here. To start off, I think this place is definitely part of a natural balance, a balance pertaining to the cycle of life and death in particular. It seems that most individuals who die in Hyrule will eventually transition into the underworld, and the only exceptions seem to be special individuals who continue to have some sort of obligation to the mortal world, those who have some sort of higher purpose or unfinished business. However, it's also implied that the depths are not the final destination for these spirits, but rather an intermediate one, because as mentioned before, the bargainer statues will eventually guide these lost souls into the actual afterlife, whatever or wherever that may be. But what's unclear is how this transition is supposed to work under normal circumstances. In-game, Link has to physically collect these spirits and then offer them up to the statue, which suggests that the bargainer statues require assistance from one or more appointed individuals who carry out this task. And who knows, maybe the tunic of the depths is somehow connected to these people. Or maybe the statues of this mysterious unknown race are. One idea I've been toying around with is that these beings could have been native to the underworld and perhaps collaborated with the bargainers at one point. One of the features on these statues is that they're holding a spherical object in their left hand, which I think most people assume is some sort of rock or mineral. However, while inspecting the model, I noticed that the rock has a swirl-like pattern on it, which is normally quite difficult to see because of the low light conditions. So maybe instead of a rock, it's supposed to be a stylistic depiction of something else, perhaps a Poe spirit. Now, I do have to clarify that the reason why this pattern is visible is because this object is actually borrowing a piece of the same texture used for the pedestal the statue stands on. So who knows, maybe it is just a rock, but I do think it's worth pointing out at least. It's also possible that under normal circumstances, spirits do have the ability to find their way to the bargainers on their own merits, but that Ganondorf's presence and influence on the underworld is somehow disturbing this process. Whatever the case may be, it's clear that there are multiple outside forces at work in the underworld. On the one hand, we have the Zonai in collaboration with other species, who not only mined for resources down here, but also constructed the light roots to dispel some of the darkness, making the area more habitable for those who dwell in the light. And on the other side of the coin we have Ganondorf, whose gloom has been spreading across the underworld like a disease. This infestation mainly takes on the form of roots, snaking through the underworld and spreading his corruption, though spreading might not be the right term to use. Instead, sapping or draining seems to be more accurate. You can clearly see a substance pulsating through these roots, which accumulates at Gloom's lair, a massive tree-like structure deep below the Hyrule Castle area, and at the heart of this tree of horrors is Ganondorf, drawing this substance in and using it to revitalize himself, or rehydrate if you will. It seems the Demon King is quite literally sucking the underworld dry. My own interpretation is that the depths are not inherently a place of evil. On the contrary, I think the surface and the underworld serve as a kind of equilibrium, a system that recycles energy or life force which has been hijacked by Ganondorf. Things that die on the surface go to the underworld, and in turn the energy that made up these life forms is stripped to its most basic form, only to rise back up through the earth to be reused for new life. Of course, I can't really prove that this is how it works, but it's the most compelling idea I can come up with, one that reveals a certain beauty to this otherwise dark and eerie place. It's apparent that the depths are incredibly ancient. We can find all sorts of things that are indicative of a long history, like these massive fossilized tree roots which are found underneath areas on the surface that have little to no vegetation, like below the Gerudo Highlands for example. Maybe in an age long ago these mountains were part of a lush forest and looked more like the mountains in Faerun. You may have noticed that in general, roots seem to be a bit of a recurring theme in Tears of the Kingdom. We have Gloom's lair, the light roots, the giant fossilized roots, the roots of the Deku Tree which extend all the way down to the underworld as well. There's clearly a lot of energy emanating from this place, and heck, it may even be the true source of ancient energy. It is kind of in the name already. The residual energy from an ancient world, the roots of Hyrule's providence. It might even be a metaphor for the roots of the Zelda series as a whole, which is something the developers have been calling back to since Breath of the Wild. The last detail I want to point out is that despite its enormous size, there's a good chance that we haven't even seen the full extent of the underworld. There's of course the possibility that it stretches beyond the border of Hyrule itself, and that other lands and kingdoms have their own equivalent. But even more unsettling is the option that the depths go much, much deeper than we're allowed to see in this game. The highest point you can reach in Tears of the Kingdom's overworld, without glitches or cheats of course, is 3,300 units on the Z-axis, and the absolute lowest you can physically go is minus minus 2,525, which is located at Gloom's lair. And just to clarify, the 0 mark for the z-axis is sea level. That's a total of 5,825 units of vertical space to explore, which is pretty insane considering that Hyrule is about 8,000 units north to south. However, as you've probably noticed, the deepest point isn't on solid ground. Instead, it's the boundary of a bottomless hole, the absolute maximum amount of depth you can reach before Link voids out, as it's called. So, what's at the bottom of this hole? Breath of the Wild has already proven that just because a chasm is inaccessible in one game doesn't mean it's bottomless. It's just the developer setting boundaries for the explorable space. But from an in-universe perspective, this hole has to lead somewhere. And where to or how deep it actually goes is something we can only imagine. Maybe it leads to actual hell. What's most striking to me about this general area is that there's already pre-existing Zonai architecture here, which I'd imagine was built before Ganondorf was trapped in the underworld. I mean, there's literally a diving platform right at the edge of this bottomless abyss, and God only knows why or what it was used for. I don't know, maybe the Zonai didn't disappear back into the heavens, and instead they all cannonballed into the Earth's core. And I think that pretty much covers it for today. Obviously there's a lot more to the depths in general, and I'm sure creators, including myself, will continue to find ideas to explore and theorize about. I also want to emphasize that just because the depths share a few similarities to the Japanese underworld of Yomi, that of course doesn't mean that I'm proposing that they are the same in the literal sense. The comparisons I've given today are obviously cherry-picked to tell a compelling story. I do genuinely think the concept of Yomi had some degree of influence on the way the depths are portrayed, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there are definitely things that aren't found in one or the other. And you know, this is to be expected. Zelda has never borrowed from just one single source. It's a hodgepodge of various cultural influences, from Christianity to Middle Eastern culture, Buddhism, Shintoism, alien folklore, all mixed in with the developer's own imagination. So it's rarely as simple as saying, yeah, this place is totally from that one religion or from that specific movie. More likely it's a combination of several things. That said, I do think it's beneficial to study these influences, big or small as they may be, because it offers a window into the minds of the developers and can help to unravel what it is that they may have tried to convey. The Ancient Cistern is a prime example of that. If you don't know anything about Buddhism, it's just a dungeon like any other. But once you know why it looks and functions the way it does, it elevates the experience to a whole new level. Thank you for watching what was supposed to be my Halloween episode, but that ship has sailed unfortunately, so sorry for that. I guess we can still pretend like it's Halloween. Anyway, a special thanks to my newest supporter, Nick de Weger, and of course to the rest of my lovely Patreons and channel members. You continue to make this channel possible. Have an amazing week, and I hope to see you all next time.